This video will contain literally nothing about the mechanics of studying for software engineering interviews. Instead, I'm going to focus on why so many aspiring software engineers are burnt out and are struggling with motivation to study Leetcode, and why we get demoralized every day before we start the studying process, and how to build consistent motivation while you are on the grind to get a software job. My name is KC, and my goal is to help people feel less alone in their careers and lives. In order for me to fully break down my thoughts, I think it makes sense for us to first describe what burnout is and how it applies to the software engineering job search. Just because burnout is a term you hear thrown around all the time. And in the classic sense, we usually define burnout as the people who are working like 80 hours a week for their whole life. And then one day they snap and they're unable to work anymore. There's no arguing this is definitely a definition of burnout. But that's not what quite happens with people studying for software jobs. There's a more slow burnout that can be easily ignored. For the people who silently decide that they hate their job, they hate their school, and they hate studying for software interviews, but are in denial of it. And slowly over time, this all begins to boil underneath until one day they also snap. And this kind of burnout, I think we can define as when the efforts invested do not meet the perceived rewards. This is my experience from when I was struggling to get my first software job, when I was grinding these interview questions. There is essentially no reward for a long time. So if you imagine the graph of success for your story, we expect a very linear growth for doing these questions, where we work a little every day, we feel ourselves getting better every day, and then one day we're ready for interviews, like Google, Amazon, whatever. But in reality, the graph of when we're ready comes much more suddenly and all together at once. It isn't until all the small details we get from studying Leetcode over months finally all click that we get there. And because of that, because of this area between our expectations and the reality, this is the reason we get burnt out while on the search for software jobs. This is why we have no motivation to keep grinding these questions. It took me a lot of trial and error to figure out the different mindset shifts I needed to make this whole process easy. When I saw a lot of my classmates, my friends, my coworkers, my acquaintances get jobs at big tech companies without even seeming like they tried, I would look at myself and think, what am I doing wrong? In our world, we can easily access a lot of these little success stories and just forget how much effort was invested into them. If you take a look at this survey from Blind, where people who are in top tech companies were asked how much Leetcode they studied, the majority of these people studied between 100 and 350 questions. And with that, we realized that most of these people working in these companies, they aren't geniuses. Most of them just had to put in cold, hard work before they were able to get that job. And this concept of feeling like things are easier than they seem, which is called overestimating our own abilities. If we go back to the burnout graph, efforts invested versus rewards perceived, to reduce burnout, we can either tone down our efforts or up our rewards perceived. Obviously, toning down our efforts will not help us get a job faster. So the main thing we need to do is to focus on the rewards by focusing on small victories and milestones in the process. For me, when I was studying, my only success condition was when I was able to get a job, which means that in the 6 months and 600 applications, my only indication that I was on the right path is at the end, which is a painful path to walk. What I wish I did during that time instead was to make small milestones for every step of the journey. The first time I got invited to an on-site interview, the first time I nailed a dynamic programming or recursion question during an interview. These are all milestones we can make for ourselves and to lessen the overall burnout and make it easier on this long and grueling study process that will probably be on for a long time. But even with small milestones, it can be easy to be constantly thinking about all the other limiting factors, like being frustrated with the whole process. This was especially painful on my motivation to study Leetcode because while I was doing it, I started to get mad. First at myself for not working harder in college, and then at the interview process itself. I started to feel like no one should have to use a dynamic programming permutation question with like 3 separate data structures on their job when their actual work is probably just creating a list on a web page. And this frustration would make me really start to spiral and get angry at the whole process, which is called self-sabotaging behavior. Imagine yourself trying to bake bread. You're sitting there You know that the process will take 1 hour, but you get impatient. You want the bread to be done faster before the 1 hour mark. So instead, you open the oven door every 10 minutes to check on it, to see if it's done. But ironically, every time we check on it, we make the estimated time of completion longer. By worrying about the bread, by trying to make the process faster, we actually extended it. And the bread baking takes 90 minutes instead of 60 minutes. And for me, being angry at these tech companies, being angry at the processes, that was me checking the bread every 10 minutes. It would prevent me from getting started with studying in the morning because I would start to think like, what's the point? Like, why am I doing this? And because of those beliefs, I started to look for shortcuts in my studying process. Instead of trying to understand the basics or do a little every single day, I would try to instead look up specific questions that specific companies were asking and hope that if I memorized enough of them, that I would one day get them on an interview and be able to pass. But in doing that, I set back my own process. And I had to accept that this whole process of grueling interviews, this is just how it was. I may not like the game, but if I wanted a job, I had to play it. This was the reality. And with the reality set, what was I going to do about it? There was one problem that would still affect my motivation, and that was the fear of failure. Anyone probably knows that getting rejected from an interview, it sucks. It is painful. The down moments of getting a job are debilitating, and it makes you question why you are doing it in the first place. But again, progress towards your goal will not be a straight line. Sometimes things have to get much worse before they get better. When we are applying these concepts, when we're focusing on the long haul for getting software jobs, when we've accepted that this process is going to be difficult and take a lot of time, we might end up feeling like we're getting rejected more and more and more. And it might seem like we're getting much worse overall. We messed up this interview, we stumbled over here, we felt awkward in this situation. But again, progress is not a straight line, and things will likely get worse before they get better. The solution to this is to ask ourselves a couple of questions. How will I know if what I am doing is working? What kind of results can I realistically expect in 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, or a year? And how will I know I'm on track towards a goal? Once you answer these questions, you can more easily focus on your goal. Failing interviews, these are just stepping stones. And I know that whenever I had a failed interview or an awkward flub, it was just something that I needed to remember, make note of, and get better the next time I did one. If you enjoyed this video about struggling to get started with motivation for Leetcode, you might want to check out this video about my struggles with transforming my motivation and eventually getting a job at Intuit. Thanks for watching.